Right. So, David, thank you for your time. Very nice to meet you, and I was pleased to see you retweeted my article because that made me feel well. I the aim is always to express people's ideas in a way that they would accept and see as kind of more or less inaccurate. So portrayal of their ideas. So what got you into transhumanism initially, and when did you get into it?
Good heavens. Well, long before I'd heard of the term transhumanism, like many small children, I was disturbed by the concept of death. And around about, 7 or 8, I decided I was going to find a cure for the aging process by the time I was 18, because I read somewhere we lost 2,000 brain cells a day. In my early teens, I became a little more realistic. It was unlikely that I was going to find a cure for aging. So I stumbled across Robert Ettinger, The Prospect of Immortality, and resolved to be cryonically frozen instead. But generally, of the different strands of transhumanism, which simplistically super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness, my own focus has long really been the problem of suffering in both humans and non-humans. And I can trace, family history, third generation vegetarian. As a little kid, I used to rescue ants and worms. I mean, back at the age of 4 or 5, rescuing ants and worms from the tarmac, I couldn't foresee a kind of pan-species welfare state, but I can trace roots. I was a depressive, melancholic teenager wrestling with the problem of suffering. I was entranced by discovering wireheading, this intracranial self-stimulation and how it shows no tolerance. No one else seemed to share my enthusiasm for perpetual bliss like that. So I realized we would have to preserve information sensitivity. And then, just reading up pop science, biotechnology. I mean, this was, of course, before the genome had been human genome had been decoded or anything like that. But I always assumed that my views were unpublishable. But then came the World Wide Web, and in 1995 I wrote this online manifesto, The Hedonistic Imperative, which the name misleads somewhat, although I do think we're heading for a future of superhuman bliss. It should really have been entitled Our Moral Obligation to Use Biotech to Get Rid of Suffering Throughout the Living World. A young stand-up comedian and an LSE postgrad called Nick Bostrom got in touch, and one thing led to another, and we set up the World Transhumanist Association, now rebranded Humanity Plus. And so, that's a kind of a right. potted history.
and when Nick got in touch with you, were you working as in academic philosophy?
No, though unfortunately I have a rather clotted academic style. I'm what would probably be called an independent researcher, a term that normally makes my heart sink, because if someone sends me a manuscript, I'm thinking, oh God, this is a crank. But no, I'm normally based in Brighton. For the past 25 plus years now, I've just kept this little network of websites with headweb.com, the original motherlode site, very much web 1.0, in which, the abolitionist project, paradise engineering, biohappiness revolution, I've banged the drum for this particular conception of transhumanism over the past quarter of a century ago. Yeah.
And you said that you thought your views were unpublishable. Why did you think that?
There's this kind of Overton window of what is and isn't kind of politically sensible or realistic to say. And if we are serious about fixing the problem of suffering, we're going to have to use got to use the E word, eugenics, genome reform, both for humans, i.e., we're going to have universal access to pre-implantation genetic screening, counseling, genome editing. And in the case of non-humans, well, back 30 years ago, cultured meat was sci-fi. That's no longer outside the Overton window. But something like reprogramming the global ecosystem, genetically tweaking predators, pan-species welfare state, that is pretty much, still well outside the Overton window. Not perhaps to the extent it was 25, 30 years ago, but recall before the internet, you could declaim on Hyde Park Corner, or you could self-publish, so-called vanity publishing, but essentially, the media gatekeepers ensured that, if you had views that really were seriously left field, they were just essentially invisible.
Yeah. So then the World Transhumanist Association is launched. At that point, I suppose it was the kind of the in some ways the golden age of transhumanism, or at least the kind of the first age of the 90s seems to be, it was a very vital scene, different kinds of characters and organizations discovering each other through the internet. How broad a church was the movement then, and what are your memories of that period of the kind of 90s? And
yes, I mean, to be honest, I associated transhumanism with extrapianism, libertarianism, free market fundamentalism, and the American West Coast. And I was very wary, although I thought of the name and registered the domain and so on. It was Nick who was telling me, yes, you are a transhumanist, but if you were to say the term transhumanism in the 1990s, it just wouldn't mean really what it does now. I mean, it's simplistic to say that the Moors, for example, and the Extropy Institute, free market fundamentalists or anything like that, but it was that kind of current. And for the first decade of this century, the World Transhumanist Association was the overarching transhumanist organization. But since then, even though the influence, as you rightly pointed out in your article, of transhumanism has grown, the movement itself organizationally has fragmented, balkanized. And although, I'll cite something like the Transhumanist Declaration of 1998 and 2009 and so on, essentially there is no canonical text or body. Transhumanism, it's very much work in progress, stipulative definitions, because of the amount of money that's been pouring into effective altruism from the crypto sphere. In some ways, the center of gravity has shifted towards effective altruism, but the same themes, particularly as you know, kind of long-termism and so on, are intimately connected with the whole transhumanist project. It's a large and growing ecosystem, shall we say?
Okay, so in terms of your kind of vision, so as you said, like genetic engineering will play a part in it. How would that work? I mean, what is? Tell me about it.
I mean, for a start, I mean, if you consider the constitution of the World Health Organization and their definition of health, a state of complete physical, emotional, social well-being, that is transhumanist. Not even talk about gradients of intelligent bliss, just complete well-being. But the only way to achieve anything remotely resembling good health, as outlined by the WHO, will be actually tackling our genetic source code, and something like, I mean, the hedonic treadmill. More people than was once the case are aware of hedonic adaptation, but there is simply no evidence that, on average, most people today are happier or unhappier than our ancestors on the African savannah. If you look at people with locked-in syndrome, for example. A third are often very severely unhappy, but 2/3 approximately of people with, complete paralysis, only being able to communicate via kind of blinking or something like that, report being quite happy or very happy. And this doesn't differ from the population at large. And so if we are morally serious about tackling the problem of suffering, we're going to have to essentially raise hedonic set points, hedonic range. I mean, it was known even before the genetic revolution from twin studies, very high degree of concordance, studying monogenetic and fraternal twins, that, there's a very high degree of genetic loading, hedonic tone, hedonic range, hedonic set points. This has been confirmed by molecular biology, molecular genetics. And so if we want to raise the overall well-being, let's start, if we're talking about humans rather than non-human animals, the human population, we're going to have to start tweaking the genomes. And, prospective parents can already, in principle, at any rate, be given the option of either the traditional genetic crapshoot, placing your faith in God or Mother Nature to have happy kids, or choosing variants of something like the FAR or the far out gene or the COMT gene or the SCN9A gene, and essentially loading the genetic dice in their kids' favor. Now, at one stage, the first so-called designer babies being born in China a few years ago, I thought, this is it. This is the start of the reproductive revolution. They were conceived in very unfortunate circumstances, and the focus was, HIV was the cover story, and practice it was probably an attempt to boost the cognitive performance of the kids in question, given the genetic mutation in animal models actually boost cognition. But if China had decided, as seemed possible at one stage, to claim credit for the first designer babies, this would have inaugurated the revolution. As we know, the researcher in question, together with some of his colleagues, wasn't fully in the political loop, and so that is currently stalled. But looking further ahead, starting with the well-recognized genetic diseases, but then going on to pain disorders, depression, and so on. I do tentatively foresee this kind of reproductive revolution. And if you were assuming that you consider it morally justifiable to bring more life and suffering into the world, you'll have the choice, the opportunity of loading the genetic dice in your favor. And if you could choose the approximate hedonic range, hedonic set point, pain threshold of your future offspring, would you do so, or would you trust in fate?
So if someone then has a genetic disposition to mental illness now, should they do you think that they have a kind of moral obligation not to have children?
In general, I am a soft antinatalist. I think Darwinian life is monstrous, that we are sentient malware, and creating the code for horrendous suffering is unethical. However, I'm not a strong antinatalist because the nature of selection pressure means that the future belongs to life lovers. So let's assume that someone is determined to have kids. And rather than simply saying someone with a severe mental disorder shouldn't choose to have kids, I would say that, they have an obligation to use pre-implantation genetic screening, counseling, and soon genome editing to try to make sure that their future offspring have the best possible opportunities in life. Essentially no one with depression wants to have depressive kids. There are complications, so-called elective disability, cases of a couple who are deaf wanting to have deaf children. But on the whole, essentially people with mental disorders do not want to have offspring with mental disorders, not least children who are temperamentally, mentally very healthy, psychologically very happy. It's the kind of the winning strategy.
And has that,
Genetically.
I mean, I suppose, have you in your life kind of faced those kinds of questions, like, should I have children? What kind of, will my children be happy or suffering? And how is that, how have you thought about that in terms of how's that, I bet you have, and how have you kind of, what conclusions did you come to?
Well, as I said, personally, I think life on Earth is monstrous. Something like 800,000 humans take their own lives each year. That's just the tip of an iceberg of misery. Even temperamentally happy people in the course of a lifetime, whether it's an unhappy love affair, bereavement, and so on, all manner of suffering. Yeah, personally, I don't think it's ethically permissible to bring new involuntary suffering into the world. So
Yeah.
although if someone presents me with their little baby, I coo and say how beautiful it is, and I don't say, "Oh, this grotesque bundle of Darwinian malware should have been strangled at birth," or anything tactless like. No, no, but nonetheless, yeah, from an ethical perspective, I don't know how to justify natalism, but I don't go down, as I said, this Benatarian route. It is just not a sociologically, politically viable solution to the problem of suffering. To urge antinatalism, the future, yes, selection pressure ensures that the future belongs to fanatical life lovers.
What is Benitarian?
Oh, David Benatar, a South African philosopher, better never to have been. Yeah, if anything, my view of life on Earth is darker than David Benatar. But yeah, he essentially urges uh, global antinatalism as a solution to the problem of
Right.
suffering, because yeah, essentially there is nothing wrong with a world in which there is no sentience, where there are unspeakable things wrong with a Darwinian biosphere. And yeah, my disagreement with David Benatar isn't over his diagnosis, which, if anything, is too rosy. It's more of the practicalities.
Okay. Right. Um, so you think there's a kind of natural selection for maybe you don't, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but for life lovers, for optimistic people, or at the very least you think there should be artificial selection for happier people. But is happiness necessarily an evolutionary advantage? And is there a risk of a kind of the creation of a species who are happier, but actually um, maybe perhaps less inventive? In other words, could we create like a species of happy panda-like humans who are very blissful, but not very innovative, not very progressive?
I mean, all kinds of scenarios can be envisaged, but on the whole, it is unipolar depressives who tend to get stuck in a rut, whereas the happiest people actually are more likely to be inventive, creative, sensation seekers. This is the kind of inversion of the Huxleyan Brave New World scenario. Um, what else can I say? I mean, in terms of evolutionary terms, creating happy offspring, it's a kind of high risk, high reward scenario. Depression seems to be an adaptation to group living. It's associated with subordination, defeat, keeping your head down. It could be disastrous if you're a Delta minus male challenging the reigning alpha on the African savannah. You could get badly mauled, kicked out of the troop. Involves keeping your head down. And so getting rid of low mood, for example, is more likely to lead to alphas who don't let themselves be bossed around, with the societal implications there. In terms of kind of creativity. It's worth distinguishing between, once again, this is rather crude, kind of hedonic tone, which is associated with mu opioid function, and motivation, mesolimbic dopamine function. And they both can be tweaked. One can amplify or damp down one or the other. And so, yes, it is possible to imagine a future of serene lotus eaters, but it's also possible to imagine civilization of hyperthymic, hyper-motivated, I'm not clinically manic, but yeah, certainly driven individuals who are tremendously creative.
Okay.
But
Right.
this is it. These are options for the future. I mean,
Yeah.
as
Okay.
long as we get rid of the biology of involuntary suffering, I'm personally relatively relaxed what kind of civilization we live in.
Okay. And so besides genetic engineering, you also are interested in the other kind of methods for the engineering of bliss would be drugs and electrical implants. Tell me about drugs. What kind of drugs are you interested in, or have you explored that yourself, or to what, just I'm interested in the overlap between transhumanism and drugs, whether it's psychedelics or, nootropic drugs.
Let's start with mood and motivation before going on to psychedelics. We don't yet have a soma, a supposedly
Mm.
ideal pleasure drug, though soma wasn't really ideal. Today's antidepressants are pretty lame. One of the reasons for this is that the neurotransmitter system most directly involved in hedonic tone is the opioid system, with all the potential to abuse of opioid drugs there. And obviously, there are also euphoriant drugs, but what today's euphoriant drugs do is tend to kick into gear the brain's negative feedback mechanisms, aside from all their other problems. So, though I'm very interested in sustainable mood brightness, nonetheless, I think it'd be far better if we aim to have civilized default settings rather than trying to drug our offspring from birth. Um, Psychedelics raise a whole host of other issues. I don't personally recommend people to explore psychedelia until we get our reward circuitry sorted out. Although there's a lot of hype at the moment about their therapeutic potential, in a sense, the most troubled people are most likely to have the worst trips, whereas the very happiest people are actually most likely to have life-changing epiphanies and a wonderful time. So their effects are very unpredictable. And so, yeah, when one is considering psychedelics, two separate questions. What is their intellectual significance, which I think is potentially hard to overstate? And what is their therapeutic potential? And I'm much more cautious than a lot of psychonauts here about their therapeutic potential because of all sorts of reasons, that unpredictability. In terms of transhumanism and futurism, there is a big gap between transhumanists, futurists, EAs, the rationalist community, people who are and aren't drug naive. I mean, someone like Nick Bostrom, for example, yeah, he wouldn't take any psychedelic because he's worried that it would mess up his rationality. And one knows that, yeah, taking psychedelics leaves casualties. And if one reads some of the babblings or just listens to the babblings of people who've taken psychedelics, I can see why a lot of the drug naive are unimpressed. But to use an example, I sometimes invoke, imagine a tribe of congenitally blind super rationalists, and one of the members of the tribe discovers a drug that induces visual experiences, though without obviously changing sort of sensory apparatus or anything like that. How, if you have discovered this drug that induces what we would call visual experiences, do you communicate the significance of this drug to the blind rationalists of the tribe? I mean, as far as they're concerned, taking this drug, it doesn't lead to any kind of productive activity, economic, no new scientific discoveries, no artistic genius, a lot of talk about the ineffable and the inexpressible. Now, we obviously, as humans, sighted humans, can say, well, yes, discovering visual experience, it is an extraordinarily seminal thing to do. But from the point of view of this mystical drug taker who discovers visual experience, but without any kind of conceptual scheme, visual experience hasn't been recruited for any information signaling purpose for his tribe. Essentially, it's just mystical babblings. So that's an analogy. It's only an analogy. But yeah, essentially, I think there are, well, billions of different state spaces of experience, as different as waking from dreaming consciousness or the visual world from the auditory world, that await discovery. That one shouldn't imagine the future will be lived in what we call ordinary waking consciousness.
So, and your vision for the abolition of suffering, not just in humans, but of all species. I mean, this is a very, it's a very ambitious vision, even among transhumanists, because you're talking about a complete reordering of the ecosystem then. And I mean, it reminds me of the Russian cosmist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who said, no atom should be a non-blissful species. Therefore, there should be the eradication of all lower species. The atoms should only exist in blissful species. I mean, that's what this would evolve, no, or involve. It would involve, the eradication of all existing species and the creation of new species.
It depends if you're a species essentialist. Given my dark views of Darwinian life, I wouldn't personally be sad if Darwinian life were to disappear. In practice, however, most people want to conserve charismatic megafauna, the members of the cat family, for example. And so if realistically one wants to preserve approximations to today's charismatic megafauna, one has to do a bit of light genetic tweaking. Now, yeah, and it's feasible. I mean, yeah,
they would all be herbivores.
Essentially, yeah, to herbivorize the living world. Naively, this sounds ecologically illiterate. Surely, if all creatures were herbivores, there would be an uncontrolled population explosion, Malthusian catastrophe, more suffering. But no, one uses everything from case of large terrestrial vertebrates, cross-species immunocontraception to, and this is less obvious, something like tunable synthetic gene drives that can remotely control fertility and indeed hedonic tone, hedonic set points, pain thresholds of entire free living species of sexually reproducing organisms. So yeah, essentially, I think our goal should be a pan-species welfare state. Before letting philosophers loose on the global ecosystem, one would want to do pilot studies in self-contained artificial biospheres. Before we can seriously start civilizing nature, we've got to stop systematically harming non-humans with animal agriculture. But this revolution is probably going to occur via cultured meat and animal products, as well as moral advocacy this century. But the question is, what then? Do we aim for rewilding, Pleistocene rewilding, some kind of notional conservation of nature reserves, wildlife reserves before the human impact? Or alternatively, do we aim to civilize the living world? The level of suffering in nature is going to be an adjustable parameter. What level of suffering is optimal?
Okay. Have there been people in the transhumanist community who've said, like, who've been basically kind of apocalyptic and said, right, that because of, we've got to abolish suffering, and the easiest way to do that is to abolish humanity and start again.
Most transhumanists are optimists by temperament. Negative utilitarians like me, suffering focused ethicists, are unusual within transhumanism. Yeah, there is at least one current in transhumanism that rather welcomes the possibility of displacement of humans by intelligent machines, super intelligence. But on the whole, I would say, yeah, that's unusual. You've got these different conceptions of what is super intelligence. Very, very simplistically, you've got people like me who essentially saying, yeah, essentially we're going to edit our genetic source code, we're going to augment ourselves by AI, but personally, I'm a disbeliever in classical Turing machines waking up or anything like that. I don't think they're the right kind of architecture to support AGI. Essentially, post-human superintelligence as our biological, genetic, AI-enhanced descendants. That's one conception, probably the minority one. Then there's the kind of the Kurzweilian vision of essentially a fusion of humans and our machines, maybe some kind of mind uploading, something like that. Very optimistic vision. But then there is the I.J. Good, Eliezer Yudkowsky, Miri Bostromian conception of superintelligence, which tends to see, an explosion of recursively self-improving AI as likely, and the future status of humans is very ambiguous there. Eliezer has recently tipped very much into the super pessimistic camp. He thinks, human doom is highly likely. Nick is pretty cautious and pessimistic there. I said personally, I'm not a believer in a zombie apocalypse, but in terms of, when one talks about human extinction, there are apocalyptic scenarios, and then there are gradualist scenarios involving essentially, genetic rewrites, AI, or augmentation and things. Yeah.
But are there? Have you come across transhumanists who actively want the extinction of humanity?
Only in the sense that they would like us to become fully transhuman or post-human, not in the sense that they are so troubled by the problem of suffering that they think it would be best if we went extinct. It's said on the whole, and as I said, transhumanists tend to be life lovers, life affirmers, in search of radical life extension. People like Nick Anders Sandberg, they wear their cryonics bracelets. Max Moore, as you know, now runs Cryonics Institute. Yeah, it's essentially non-apocalyptic scenarios.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. What happened to transhumanism then? I mean, you painted a very good scene of it. You say it fragmented. Why did it fragment, and what did it fragment into?
Here we've got to go off the record.
Cut. All right, here we go.
Not that I, yeah.
How do you think, and what do you think of transhumanism's adoption by the richest people in the world?
Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, one wants the rich and the powerful to become transhumanist and to make the ethic and the philosophy their own. I mean, it's complicated. I mean, someone like Elon Musk, for example, though he's funded, a number of transhumanist organizations, will actually disavow radical life extension, whereas Jeff Bezos, on the other hand, very keen on it. Realistically, if we are to have a triple S civilization of super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness, we need to get rich people on board. Now, yeah, there is this criticism that is transhumanism going to be exclusively the preserve of either the very rich or at least the affluent of the success of the extremely successful. In one sense, I'm optimistic in the sense that anything that can be digitized is going to be effectively free. That the kind of the smartphone of the African peasant in Kenya, it may not be the latest iPhone 14, but it's better than models of a few years ago. That in one sense, access to cultural resources, academic resources, critically access to genetic resources too, for some kind of genomic revolution. That's going to be ubiquitous, and getting powerful, influential people on board. This is the future. None of this, undercuts. I mean, as I said, I think of in terms of billionaires, of obscenely wealthy, and I can think of far better things to do with hundreds of billions than the colony on Mars, for example. But rather, if it's a choice of staying pure and impotent or co-opting the richest, most influential people on the planet, one wants the latter.
And what do you think of? I mean, obviously, the movements that are very well funded at the moment are like long-termism and effective altruism, as well as things like longevity research and so on. But like, in terms of what's the relationship between long-termism and effective altruism and transhumanism?
Complicated, but given if insofar as transhumanism is a vision for the long-term future, I mean, let me just focus on the problem of suffering. If one takes the view that we want to rewrite our genetic source code and make suffering, any form of experience below hedonic zero, impossible, kind of genome editing is a recipe for not merely the near future, but the very far future too. I mean, it's not technically the case that germline editing is irreversible. Changes could be reversed, but in practice, like smallpox, I think we're going to make suffering history. There is quite a big separation, however, between the majority currents in long-termists who are classical utilitarians and the more suffering-focused EAs, transhumanists like me, and though one can paper over the cracks, nonetheless, if you're a suffering-focused ethics, your preoccupation is going to be very, very different from a classical utilitarian. Though both, this is rather unintuitive, both classical utilitarianism, it's not clear that it's consistent with any kind of complex civilization. Should we be aiming, if you're a classical utilitarian, for some kind of utilitarian shockwave? This is with utilitarian or hedonium matter and energy optimized for pure bliss. I mean, if you believe in AGI, an AGI with a classical utilitarian utility function should presumably blast out a hedonium or utilitarian shockwave, maximizing the cosmic abundance of value in our forward light cone. But most classical utilitarians, they're not thinking of the utilitarian shockwave scenario. In some cases, like Nick, if you believe in digital sentience, you're imagining zillions of digital paradises. But if you're a long-termist who is a Buddhist or a negative utilitarian, you're focused on minimizing, preventing, abolishing suffering in the long term in our forward light cone.
Right. Okay. And just finally, David, like one of the things I'm looking at is the backlash against transhumanism, and how in the kind of conspiracy ecosystem. There's been, transhumanism has become one of the kind of the bogeymen. It's got mixed up with kind of anti-vax thinking or ideas that there's some elite plot to cull the human population or implant everyone with tracking chips, this kind of thing. Is that something you've seen come across? Is that something that's been going for a while, or just what are your thoughts on that kind of conspiratorial backlash to transhumanism?
Yes, I mean, you're right. And I think COVID very much accentuated this trend because, with kind of lockdown, thinking everyone as a potential plague bearer, it affected all kinds of people in society. I mean, one sees, Putin and these vast long tables. To be a successful politician, you have to be paranoid. Has COVID tipped a fair number of people over the edge? Transhumanism has got mixed up with a lot of conspiratorial thinking. Having said that, this claim transhumanists are eugenicists. Well, technically speaking, at least in many cases, yes. I mean, not all transhumanists are eugenicists. Some believe in essentially, kind of mind uploading and leaving our biological substrates behind. But among transhumanists, which I'm one that are very, very skeptical of these scenarios, yes, if you are going to create a triple S civilization, super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness, we're going to have to practice eugenics, not in the sense of the late 19th century, early 20th century racial hygiene or anything like that. But essentially reprogramming the biosphere is good genes. So a mixture of the complete nonsensical balderdash and stuff that has some more than a grain of truth. But I should probably, if we're wrapping things up, I should probably stress that one can support eugenics. I've got a little video on eugenics.org, and also believe that something like the sanctity of life should be enshrined in law. This isn't eugenics in the 20th century sense, but nonetheless, critics are right when they use the E word. Technically, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Anything I haven't asked about that you'd like to mention or bring in, or anything you think that I left out of my article, or interesting angles to explore?
Essentially, if you've got any follow-ups or ideas, to bounce off. I'm not the kind of person with an appointment secretary or anything like that. Free to have another chat and a follow-up. But otherwise, no. As I said, it's just
great.
Good to touch base. I thought you did a fantastic job.
Thank you, David. Very nice to meet you. Enjoy this beautiful day in Portugal. And I hope to talk to you further down the road.
Awesome. Take care.
Okay.
Cheers, Jules.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.
And I'm